The room was alive with celebration, laughter spilling from every corner, glasses clinking under the golden light of a chandelier that had seen generations of joy and sorrow. A wedding day, that sacred passage where two families intertwine, where love is stitched into memory with music, vows, and photographs that would outlive the moment. The bride stood radiant in white, polished to perfection, a vision of grace. The groom stood tall beside her, his smile wide, his spirit lifted. But beneath all that beauty and ceremony, something unexpected was about to unravel. It would not be the flowers or the food or the weather that people remembered. No, it would be a moment of truth. A wound, and then a reckoning. The singer had arrived hours before, a black man with a voice carved from the trials of his people, carrying the weight of gospel, blues, and soul in every note. His name was Elijah. He wasn't famous, not by the world's measure, but when he sang, he made strangers weep and friends hold hands tighter. He had been hired to give the ceremony a sound that lifted it into heaven, and he carried that responsibility with pride. For him, every performance was sacred. Every song was prayer. Elijah stepped up to the microphone, dressed not in opulence but in quiet elegance, a crisp black suit, polished shoes, and eyes that spoke of long nights rehearsing and longer days carrying the dignity of his ancestors. The first notes rolled out, smooth and strong, and the room shifted. Conversation softened. Heads turned. The crowd was caught by the gravity of his gift. The bride's mother smiled. The groom's aunt whispered, "That man can sing." Even the children stopped fidgeting and leaned in, as if Elijah's voice had reached into their small hearts and whispered peace. But not everyone welcomed the sound. The bride, standing there adorned in lace and luxury, stiffened. Her smile faltered. She whispered something sharp to her bridesmaid, eyes darting toward Elijah with a flicker of disdain. And then, in a moment that sliced through the air like broken glass, she spoke louder than she should have. "Why did he bring him? I wanted someone classier. Someone that fit this wedding." The words weren't meant for everyone, but they carried. The DJ, the photographer, two groomsmen each heard. And worse, Elijah heard too. His voice did not falter, though inside he felt the sting, a familiar sting, the kind black folks know all too well. That quiet dismissal, that subtle degradation wrapped in the language of class and fit. As if his skin, his presence, his art did not belong in the beauty of that moment. As if the centuries of song carried by black singers, the same songs that built American weddings, funerals, and celebrations, were not enough. He kept singing, because dignity demands perseverance. But inside, the wound bled. And the groom heard it too. At first, he froze. His joy flickered, his jaw tightened. He looked at his bride, the woman he had chosen, the woman he thought he knew. And then he looked at Elijah, the man giving his soul as a gift to their union. The groom saw the pain, even though Elijah tried to hide it behind the strength of his voice. The room didn't stop. The celebration rolled on. Guests clapped when the song ended, Elijah bowed slightly, and the ceremony pressed forward. But an invisible tension hung in the air, a quiet storm waiting to break. What the bride did not know, what no one but the groom truly understood, was who Elijah was to him. Elijah was not just a hired voice. He was the man who had sung to him when he was lost, who had carried him with him when he sat in the back of a small church years ago, grieving the death of his father. Elijah was the one who had stood beside his mother when she had nothing, offering free songs at her birthday, reminding her she was still worthy of joy. Elijah was not just a singer. He was family in spirit, a brother by bond deeper than blood. And so, as the bride insulted him, the groom felt something break. Not just disappointment, but revelation. He was watching the woman he loved reveal a shadow he had not seen, or perhaps had chosen not to see before. That shadow had now come to dance in the light of their wedding day. The hours moved, the vows were said, and rings exchanged. But Elijah's voice lingered in the groom's ears like a call to courage. The bride smiled for pictures, posed for the cake cutting, but behind her grace, the groom carried a storm inside. He thought of Elijah, who sat quietly in the back during dinner, alone at a table, picking at his plate, his dignity intact but his spirit bruised. The groom excused himself from the laughter and found Elijah. He sat with him, shoulder to shoulder, and whispered, "Brother, I heard it. And I will not let it stand. Elijah shook his head. It's her day. Don't make it about me. But the groom had already decided. Some moments are bigger than ceremony. Some moments test not just love but integrity. And as the night turned toward speeches, as glasses were raised and voices rang with celebration, the groom stood. He tapped the microphone, his eyes scanning the room. Everyone hushed, expecting a toast, a tender word to his bride. Instead, what they received was truth. He spoke of Elijah. He told the guests who this man was, not just a singer, but a healer, a brother, a soul who carried him through his darkest days. He spoke of dignity, of music born from struggle, of voices that built America while being told they didn't belong. He reminded the room that to insult such a man was to insult the very foundation of the culture they celebrated with. And then he said words that froze the bride in place, words that turned whispers into gasps. He said, "If my wife cannot honor the man who gave his voice to bless our union, then she does not yet understand love. For love without respect is no love at all." The bride's face burned crimson. The room went silent. Elijah lowered his head, tears stinging his eyes. The groom placed a hand on his shoulder, lifted him to stand before the guests, and declared, "This is my brother. And his voice is our blessing. If you cannot celebrate him, you cannot celebrate me." What followed stunned everyone. But that is where the story deepens. Because what began as insult would grow into revelation. What began as shame would turn into a decision that no one saw coming. The groom's response was not just a defense of his friend, it was a challenge to the very foundation of his marriage. And in the next chapter, the night would unravel into something unforgettable. The silence that followed the groom's words was heavy, like a storm cloud hanging low over the reception hall. You could almost hear hearts pounding, forks resting halfway to mouths, breaths caught in throats. Weddings are supposed to be safe havens of joy, predictable in their laughter and dancing. But now, everyone sat in the raw air of truth, and the truth was not comfortable. The bride shifted in her chair, her gown shimmering under the lights, but her spirit suddenly bare, exposed. She tried to hold her smile, but it cracked, faltered, slipped away. Guests looked from her to the groom, their eyes wide, their whispers trapped beneath clenched jaws. For some, there was embarrassment, for others, admiration. And for a select few, there was pride that a man had chosen integrity over silence. The groom held Elijah's shoulder firm, like an anchor, like a promise. He wasn't simply protecting his friend, he was drawing a line. A line that declared, "This is who I am, and I will not be moved." His voice rang with the kind of clarity that is rare at weddings, clarity that sounded more like a sermon than a toast. He spoke again, softer now, but his words still cut deep. "We all came here to celebrate love, but love cannot live in a house that rejects respect." Elijah's voice, his presence, is not out of place here. He is not here to decorate this moment. He is the moment. Without him, without the spirit he carries, we have nothing worth celebrating. Elijah shook his head, whispering, "You don't have to do this." But the groom looked at him and said, "Brother, I've been quiet too many times in my life. Not today." And then he did something no one expected. He took the microphone, pressed it into Elijah's hand, and said, "Sing. Not for us. For you. For every ancestor who carried a song when the world tried to silence them. Sing so this room never forgets what dignity sounds like." The crowd held its breath. Elijah stood frozen for a moment, torn between shame and duty. But then, slowly, he closed his eyes, lifted the microphone, and let his soul speak in song. It wasn't the song he had rehearsed. It wasn't the carefully chosen ballad the couple had agreed upon. No, this was something older, something rooted in sorrow and triumph, a spiritual that carried the weight of chains broken and spirits unbowed. His voice rose like thunder, then softened like a mother's lullaby, weaving pain and pride into the air. The bride looked down, her hands trembling in her lap. Guests clutched napkins, some dabbing at tears they hadn't expected to cry. The groom stood beside Elijah, head bowed, as if in prayer. The music filled the hall, but more than that, it filled the silence left by centuries of dismissal, centuries of being told blackness didn't belong in moments of elegance, of joy. When the last note lingered and faded, the room erupted. Not in laughter, not in applause that comes from habit, but in something deeper. Guests rose to their feet. Some shouted Amen. Others embraced. The energy shifted, the air cleared, and Elijah's voice had done what it always did, turned pain into power. But not everyone clapped. The bride remained seated, her jaw tight, her eyes glossy with anger and humiliation. To her, this was supposed to be her day, her vision. She had dreamed of perfection, and now, to her mind, it was ruined. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor, and hissed just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This isn't what I wanted." The groom turned, eyes locking on hers. His heart ached, not because she was angry, but because he saw clearly now what he had refused to see before. He saw the division between them, the fracture in values. He saw that her idea of beauty did not include his idea of truth. And in that moment, a question rose inside him, one so heavy it nearly brought him to his knees. Had he married a woman who could not honor the essence of who he was? The bride fled the room, her bridesmaids chasing after her, whispering frantically. The guests shifted in their seats, unsure of whether to follow or stay. The groom stood still, caught between duty and dignity, between saving face and saving himself. Elijah touched his arm. "Go to her," he said quietly. "She's your wife now. Go." But the groom shook his head. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried storms. A wife should walk beside her husband, not look down on the man who made him who he is. "If she cannot see you, then she cannot see me." The words rippled through the crowd, hushed gasps echoing like distant thunder. The groom was not just defending Elijah anymore, he was questioning the very foundation of his marriage, and he was doing it openly, before family and friends. Minutes passed before the bride returned, her makeup smeared, her hands clutching her gown. She looked at her groom with fury and disbelief. "Why would you humiliate me like this? Why would you choose him over me?" The groom's chest rose and fell. He didn't yell. He didn't lash out. He simply answered with the kind of stillness that makes words unforgettable. "I didn't choose him over you. I chose respect. I chose truth. If you can't stand beside a man like Elijah, then you can't stand beside me. Because without respect for my people, for my brother, there is no respect for me." The bride's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted around the room, seeing the guests, her family, his family, watching, waiting. She wanted to reclaim her control, to pull the story back to her version of the fairy tale. But the fairy tale was gone. What remained was reality, raw and unfiltered. She whispered, "You're embarrassing me." And the groom replied, "No. I'm revealing us." Those words cut deeper than any argument. They revealed not just her insult, but the truth of who they both were in that moment. And truth, once revealed, cannot be put back in the dark. Elijah, sensing the weight of what was happening, tried to leave. He gathered his things quietly, his plan to slip out without notice. But the groom stopped him once more. "Brother, you don't walk out of this room alone. Not tonight. Not ever." The two men stood side by side, their bond undeniable, their dignity unshaken. Guests rose again, some moving closer, some whispering blessings. The bride stood alone at the edge of the dance floor, torn between pride and desperation. The night stretched on, but it would not return to what it had been. The laughter was different now, heavier, mixed with reflection. The celebration carried on, but under it all was the awareness that a seed had been planted. A seed of truth. And as the music resumed, as Elijah was coaxed to sing again, as the guests danced and swayed, the bride sat quietly, her crown of perfection tilted, her vision cracked. The groom had chosen to speak. He had chosen to honor the man whose voice had lifted him in his darkest days. But more than that, he had chosen to make a stand, not just for Elijah, but for dignity itself. And what came next, in the days that followed, would shake not just their marriage, but the way everyone who witnessed that night thought about love, respect, and the power of truth. Because weddings end, but truth lingers. And when the truth is spoken loud enough, it echoes far beyond the ballroom walls. The wedding ended, as all weddings must, but the story of that night did not leave with the guests. It clung to the air, followed people home in their cars, traveled with them in whispered conversations days later. Families spoke of it over Sunday dinners, friends argued about it in hushed tones on the phone. Some said the groom was too harsh, that a wedding day should protect the bride's feelings above all else. Others said no, he was right, because silence in the face of disrespect is not love, it is surrender. But one thing was certain, no one who had been there would ever forget what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. The bride retreated in the days after, her anger settling into bitterness. She told her friends that he had embarrassed her, that he had ruined her perfect day. She didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see, the way her words had cut deeper than she realized. She held fast to the idea that the day was hers, that she was the star, and that anything that did not orbit her glow was an intrusion. The groom, on the other hand, carried a different weight. His decision had not been easy. He had wrestled with it silently for months leading up to the wedding, the small moments when his bride's words hinted at a lack of respect for people who didn't look like her, didn't come from her world. He had brushed them aside, telling himself love could smooth the edges, that marriage would heal what dating could not. But that night, under the lights, when she insulted Elijah, it became clear, love without respect is just performance. And he could not live a life built on performance. He visited Elijah a week later. They sat in Elijah's small living room, gospel records lined on the shelves, sunlight cutting through lace curtains. The groom spoke with the vulnerability of a man who had nothing left to hide. "I don't know what's going to happen with my marriage," he admitted. "But I know one thing, I'm grateful you were there. You showed me the truth. You've always shown me the truth." Elijah leaned back, his voice calm, his presence steady. "Brother, don't thank me. Thank God for giving you ears to hear and eyes to see. Sometimes we don't want to see the truth because it costs us comfort. But comfort can be a chain, too." The groom nodded, tears threatening his eyes. He realized in that moment that Elijah had not just been a singer at his wedding, not just a brother in his life. Elijah was a mirror, reflecting back the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of values he could not betray. Meanwhile, the bride's family was furious. They called him ungrateful, accused him of humiliating their daughter. They said Elijah should never have been given such importance. But the groom stood firm. He replied simply, "If you cannot honor him, you cannot honor me." And with that, lines were drawn. Weeks passed. The tension grew too heavy to ignore. The bride confronted him one night, her voice sharp with pain. "Why can't you just let it go? Why can't you just apologize for embarrassing me and move on?" And he answered, "Because apologizing for truth is the first step to burying it. I can't bury what I am. I can't bury who I love, who I honor, who has shaped me. If you marry me but cannot respect my people, then you don't really see me. You only see the part of me you think is acceptable. And I will not be cut into pieces to make someone else feel comfortable." Those words sat between them like a wall. She cried, begged, threatened, but in the end, he knew what had to be done. A marriage built on disrespect is not a marriage, it is a cage. And he had promised himself long ago he would never live in chains. So the groom made a choice. It was not easy, it was not celebrated, but it was necessary. He ended the marriage before it had truly begun. Some said he was foolish, some said he would regret it, but those who understood dignity knew better. They knew that sometimes, choosing yourself, your truth, your people, is the greatest act of love you can give. And Elijah, oh, Elijah, stood by him through it all. He sang at the groom's mother's homecoming celebration, he sang at his nephew's baptism, he sang at gatherings where family and community needed to be reminded of who they were. His voice became a thread weaving through the groom's life, a constant reminder that dignity must never be sacrificed for approval. The story spread beyond their circle. People who had been at the wedding told it again and again, and each time, the tale grew larger. It became less about one bride's insult and more about the question it raised: what do we do when respect is denied in the spaces we hold most sacred? Do we stay silent for the sake of appearances, or do we speak truth, even if it costs us? This story became a mirror for everyone who heard it. Some saw themselves in the bride, forced to face the biases they carried in silence. Others saw themselves in Elijah, reminded of the countless times they had been dismissed, undervalued, made to feel like their presence was out of place. And many saw themselves in the groom, standing at the crossroads between silence and courage, between peace and truth. But above all, it was a story about love. Not the fragile love that wilts when challenged, but the kind of love that demands respect, that refuses to separate dignity from devotion. The kind of love that says, if you cannot honor my people, you cannot honor me. Years later, people would still whisper about that wedding. Some would shake their heads in disapproval, but others would smile with quiet pride. Because in a world where silence often feels safer, one man had chosen to speak. And in speaking, he had given others permission to do the same. And Elijah? He kept singing. His voice reached new places, new hearts. He sang not just at weddings, but at rallies, at funerals, at celebrations of black life that needed a sound to carry them higher. And every time he sang, people remembered the groom who stood beside him, who said, "This is my brother. If you cannot celebrate him, you cannot celebrate me." That moment became more than a wedding memory. It became a lesson, a testimony, a living echo of what respect looks like when it is not compromised. And so the story ends not with a broken marriage, but with a truth intact. A truth that dignity must never bow. A truth that love without respect is no love at all. A truth that voices like Elijah's are not decoration, or they are salvation. So when you hear this story, carry it with you. Remember that silence is easy, but courage lasts. Remember that when you stand for dignity, you stand for generations behind you and generations ahead. And remember that sometimes the greatest vows we make are not to another person, but to ourselves, to never forget who we are and whose we are. Because in the end, the groom's response wasn't just about defending a friend. It was about declaring to the world, "I am not ashamed of my people. I am not ashamed of our sound, our song, our story. And if you cannot honor that, then you cannot honor me." And that is the kind of truth that does not fade. That is the kind of truth that leaves goosebumps long after the music stops. That is the kind of truth that becomes legacy. So I leave you with this reflection: what kind of love do you accept? The love that demands silence, or the love that insists on respect? And when the test comes, as it surely will you whisper the truth, or will you declare it for all to hear? The choice is yours. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if it stirred something inside, share it. Let it echo beyond you. Like, share, and subscribe so more voices, more stories, more truths like this one can be heard. Because our stories matter. Our dignity matters. And the world needs to hear it.